Okay, so training periodization, or how we get the most out of our training regime, if you have one. I'm sure not everyone's using one at the moment, but probably will at some point. It's actually more of a tricky subject than we would think. So periodization is a fancy word. Sometimes it's called phase potentiation, which is even more fancy. That's more in your kind of gym programs. But for tonight, we're going to talk about it as our training plan, as we're runners. And it is essentially, it's the ability to phase training into an order where we peak at a specific time, which for us is event day, whether that's marathon, half marathon, 10K, whatever it is, we want to be able to peak at the right time. So we use them to monitor progress. Obviously, we want to see progression along our training program, but we also use it to reduce injury rates, so we can kind of measure where peaks are and see where they correlate with overload injuries. We can manipulate training programs or training plans by, we've got various parameters, so volume, intensity, frequency, etc. And we're going to look at where they fit into your training plan. Despite everybody having a training plan, there's a real lack of deep scientific rigor to govern how well they work, but we'll look at what does and what doesn't. We are going to talk, of course, very generally, because the key factor is always your training history. So everyone here tonight and everyone listening will have a different, what we call training history. So how long you've been running, what level of running you're capable of. So because everyone has a different training age, we have to make it a very general discussion, and that's very hard to do. So I was asked to write the training programs for the new Swindon Half, which is now the old Swindon Half, and I wrote 3 training plans. I did a beginners, an intermediate and an advanced. And I said openly to everyone at the time, it's one of the hardest things I've ever done, because you're trying to, despite having 3 groups there, you're trying to encompass such a huge variation of runners that it's a very hard thing to do anything generically. So let's talk training plans. So we have various cycles in training plans, and I'm going to talk about how I like to see training plans structured. So again, we have a kind of a bit of a lack of strict scientific guidelines, but we'll talk about how I would structure a training plan. It's all very colourful. There's lots of colourful charts this week. So generally, successful periodization or planning is applied on a cyclical basis, which I think of as waves. And it's usually at this ratio of about 3 to 1. So we build for 3 and then drop off for 1. These kind of the axis on this side, we have low intensity, medium high, high intensity. I would exchange them for workload. Intensity isn't always the right word for runners, but you can see that I would structure it throughout the week where we're kind of progressing, backing off to recover, and then progressing, where Sunday, generally speaking, is our long, slow run for runners, which again is why I don't think intensity is necessarily the right word, because it's not our most intense session of the week, but it's certainly the hardest session of the week. It's the most fatigue-inducing session of the week. So then we go on to our mesocycle. So that was our microcycle. So mesocycle, same thing really, week to week or month to month. We would start with a medium week, which progressively gets harder through the month, before we have a back off week or a recovery week, which have become much more popular in training plans now, where we kind of build and drop off and then build again, which is what your macro cycle, what we call the macro cycle, looks like. So that would be, this is a kind of standard 12-week plan, I guess, but this could be anything. This could be a 16-week plan, a 20-week plan. This could be your year-long cycle. It very much depends on the individual. For example, I'm very fortunate. I've worked with a number of Paralympians. So we work on a 4-year cycle, for example. And actually, ironically, we were in the 4th quarter. We were kind of here, 3 months ago with the Paralympics due this year. And now we've kind of been thrown back to build again for next year, hopefully. But that shows how it varies massively. from person to person on their specific aims. But overall, like I say, I see it as waves. Over a training plan, this is what we're looking to achieve. I always say to people, you can't constantly be at your best at this stage, purely looking at the semantics of that word. If you were always at your best, if you were always there, that would just be your average. So like I say, we like a slow build, constantly progressive until we're reaching our peak before race day. And that works using progressive overload, which we'll touch on in a sec. So there is a relationship between volume and intensity, where again, early on in our training program, GPT here is general physical training. So this is where we're kind of building our engine, where we're building a nice big endurance engine as runners. And then as we get closer to event day or race day, we want to do more sport specific training. So the intensity tends to increase. And the volume doesn't necessarily drop as such an acute angle, but we definitely want to be doing our general physical training first, so building that engine, and then going into our sport specific training. We know that volume enough is not sufficient to, volume alone is not sufficient enough to improve endurance. So we have to make sure that we are building that intensity along the way. Just doing the long, slow miles, whilst it will build you that huge engine, it's not specific enough to the task at hand to maximize your aims. And so looking at those waves again, we've looked at this previously, and if you've ever been on an actual real life workshop with me, I always use this graphic. I like it a lot. Where this is where we're looking at progressive overload. I just tried to point on my screen then, that's not going to work. So overload, recovery, adaptation, and that leads to progress. Then we overload the system again, recover, adapt, progress. So you can see what we've looked at previously is this kind of nice building graph. At the top here, again, we have touched on this in some previous webinars. What happens initially, we've got our base level, which is our homeostasis, so the body's normal level. And as we're training, whether that's in the gym or running, we actually have, we call this our alarm stage or alarm phase, which is where we have a decrease from the base level, which is where we go through fatigue or DOMS or muscle damage. And then we start rebuilding as we go through our recovery, which we've done a webinar on, back to the base level. Then we go through what we call super compensation, this period here, where we adapt and improve. And then if we catch it right, we train at the right point. And again, in this bottom graph, we continually overload, recover, adapt, and then progress. This person at the top here is someone who is probably under training because they're going through the alarm, the recovery, the adaptation, but then they're not training soon enough. So they're constantly returning to base level and then starting again and constantly returning to their base level. If someone was overtraining, they would be more like they would be alarm or overload. Go back up to that. They would go overload, recovery, and then they would be training here. So they wouldn't be allowing their body enough time to adapt. So they're constantly returning to base level and not seeing the benefit to the workload they're putting in, which kind of fits into an early ripe, early rotten scenario, what I call an early ripe, early rotten scenario, where people can tend to do too much intensity too soon. And so they never really see the benefits of the hard work. And actually, what tends to happen is that intensity isn't sustainable. We think peak performance lasts for around 2 to 3 weeks, which fits in with our taper, which we'll look at near the end. But like I say, that intensity is not sustainable. So we start to detrain quickly, and we go through what we call the principle of diminishing returns, where actually the harder you train, the more intensity you put into your training, the less benefit you get from it. So that's why we want to go through this, like we just touched upon the general physical training before we start doing the sport specific fine tuning. So a couple of graphs, like I said, we've seen similar before, but training load of risk of injury. Again, the more intense the exercise, the higher the risk of injury. That's kind of common sense, I guess, to a degree, but it does form a U-shaped graph, where low or sedentary, so low activity, has a medium risk of injury. Intense exercise has a higher risk of injury, and then we have this sweet spot at the bottom. But this high risk of injury with intense exercise would come down had you done your general physical training. because you'd have built your engine, become robust enough to sustain the intense training. And again, just a quickie, training type versus injury type. So as running volume increases, we would expect to see more knee type pain, which is actually, during this period of lockdown, the most common injury I'm seeing at the moment is knee pain, primarily because people have taken it as an opportunity to increase their volume. And again, the flip of that is, as pace or intensity increases, Achilles and lower leg become more susceptible to injury. And then training load and risk of upper respiratory tract infection, or URTIs. Again, we know that if you up your intensity too quickly, your chance of an upper respiratory tract infection, which is particularly important at the moment, increases as well. So just to be aware of that. So overtraining is a dirty word, isn't it? Like, no one likes to think that they've overtrained. A few things for you guys to look out for during your training plan. So physically, other than, again, we just touched upon, are you picking up injuries that you otherwise weren't picking up? So have you got high resting heart rate? Have you got unexplained weight loss? Obviously, everyone likes to think when they're training, particularly for longer distances, that they're going to lose weight. Actually, that's very, very rarely the case. But have you got unexplained weight loss? Is there a plateau in gains? As in, again, are we going through that principle of diminishing returns? Are you working hard but not going forwards? And fatigue that isn't DOMS, so a kind of all-encompassing fatigue that is different from DOMS being delayed onset of muscle soreness, so that soreness that you get after exercise, which a lot of people, it's almost like a badge of honor, but fatigue, a different type of fatigue to DOMS. And then psychologically, people start to sleep worse. They have higher irritability. I can tick that box today, but I don't think I'm overtraining. Mental tiredness, even depression or loss of enthusiasm are all symptoms of overtraining. Essentially, overtraining to me is this imbalance between training stress and recovery adaptation, like we saw in that graph with the wave. Someone who's training, but they're not allowing their body to adapt and recover for long enough before they're training again, normally in the search of greater gains, which don't come. The biggest thing, really, the biggest measurable thing for me with a runner, and this, we've all been through this, I hear this a lot in clinic, is someone comes in and they've lost their mojo. We always use the word mojo, no idea why, but very few runners haven't lost their mojo at some point. And that comes through a number of things, but it can come through just stagnation, where people have lost their enthusiasm. They've been doing high mileage, and it's just not giving them the buzz that it once was. A couple of things that I speak about when people do tell me they've lost their mojo, and these are very anecdotal, but and none of them are particularly popular, I should say. But one thing you could consider is just changing routes or changing running style. Almost, and by style I mean if you're a road runner, try trail run-ins. The big things for me, really, for someone who's lost their mojo, and again, I appreciate they don't make me friends, but I say to people, consider running without your watch for a while, or even, God forbid, coming off Strava for a little bit, just to try and regain the joy of running for running's sake, rather than this thing we do to measure, because that puts massive amounts of pressure on ourselves. And some people go through this process of internalizing perceived external pressure, by which I mean, if people put everything they do as a runner out there for everyone to see, they suddenly feel like they've become this runner that other people are looking at. Lots of people now are almost self-elevated running influencers, and then there's that perceived external pressure becomes internal pressure, and people just stop loving what is essentially our hobby. So this is my favorite approach to running, I guess. RPE is rate of perceived exertion. So rate of perceived exertion. So how hard you feel that you're working. I could talk for a long time about heart rate. So I don't know if anyone does heart rate training. I was asked fairly recently my opinion on heart rate monitors, wrist heart rate monitors, and I think they're brilliant, but they're not as accurate as the chest strap heart rate monitor, but they're fine, and they are a great tool, because as much as they do seem to be, for want of a better word, wrong, they are at least consistently wrong. So you will see progress when it is measuring you, and it will give you your VO2 max and things like that. And again, we have to accept that they're probably wrong, but they're consistently wrong. So you can still see progress, they're just not exactly specific to you. So when we talk about heart rate zone 1, zone 2, 3, 4, 5, for example, if I was to use my Garmin heart rate zones, they are substantially off. So I know my maximum heart rate is 202, whereas if I followed my Garmin max heart rate, I think it's 180 or 178. So you can see then that the percentages are grossly off. So I can't really use my heart rate guide from my Garmin watch, which actually I don't use anyway. So I use rate of perceived exertion. Again, I've touched on this before. So how hard is hard? How hard do you think you're working? Fairly sort of straightforward and self-explanatory, I guess. 10 out of 10 is your maximal. 10 out of 10 is maximal work rate. 0, nothing. So I think RPE, rate of perceived exertion, is a great skill to develop, because it's important to understand how your body is and what your dose response is, how hard you have to work to get the perceived benefit. Polarised training is similar to what a lot of you may do already, which is 80-20 training. And 80-20 training is where we do 80% kind of slower than race pace, 20% faster than race pace. And it's a brilliant way to train. Lots of the elites do it. Polarized training is just more specific, I think, and I like it. I like it a lot. So polarized training is 80% very low and 20% very high. And when we say very high, we're talking up to 130% of your VO2 max. So again, we kind of need to know those figures, but almost, if you'll excuse the spinal tap reference, we're almost going up to 11 on our rate of perceived exertion. And like I say, as much as that 80-20 rule, I like it, and lots of people use it, and lots of people are big fans of it and write it into their training plans. I think we have to acknowledge that we're not elite runners. For 99.999% of runners that I'll ever come across, we're not elite runners. And so as much as these elite runners are doing only 20% speed work or faster work or high intensity work, that often equates to 20 or 30 miles a week doing speed work. So if you're someone doing 10 miles a week and looking to get faster, I would argue it's not enough to be doing 20% of your training at speed work, for your speed work. Sorry, like I say, we know volume alone is not enough or not sufficient enough to improve your performance, your endurance performance. So, like I say, as much as everyone is always throwing 80-20 at us as runners, we've got to remember Mo Farah is doing 120 miles a week, so he's doing 24 miles a week speed work, and it's a very, very different world from us. So I'd say polarized training looks like this: 80% very, very light or up to moderate, 20% very hard, and nothing in the middle. So that almost eliminates all of our what we would call tempo runs. This would be very much our long, slow runs, or our low heart rate runs, or I don't use recovery runs. Like I've said before, I think the word, like, it's oxymoronic to me, recovery runs. You can't recover whilst running, but they are easy runs for 80% of the time, regardless of distance. And then 20% really, really hard. And I say to people, what we want to sort of avoid is, instead of thinking we need to do our easy runs easier, let's make our hard runs harder. So RPE, rate of perceived exertion versus technology. I don't think it's necessarily an either or, but this was interesting. So subjective measures, which is our scale of 0 to 10, reflected acute and chronic train loads with superior sensitivity and consistency to objective measures, which is really interesting. So if you master that skill of measuring where you are on that scale, it gives you better feedback than using our technology. Like I say, it's not for everybody, but I think it's a brilliant skill to listen to your body. And again, trying to recognize that dose response, knowing exactly what you need to do for your training plan. Concurrent training, I've got this, I'm not going to dwell on this, but I've done a webinar, there's a very short webinar on my YouTube channel about concurrent training. So if you are marathon training and doing a strength training plan at the same time, endurance training will interfere with the resistance training. So like I say, I've got, I think it's 10 minutes on YouTube if anyone's interested in that, and how we can kind of counteract it. Recovery, so this is where we start. Between our sessions, we're aiming to dissipate that accumulated fatigue, which then enables the performance enhancing adaptation. We have to remember that those higher intensity training sessions that we've touched upon, they take longer to recover, much like when we were talking about plyometrics a few weeks ago. Those sessions take much longer to recover than the lower intensity sessions. But like I keep emphasizing, we need to learn our individual dose response and how much you can tolerate, how much is recovery on that timeline for you. Taper. Everyone loves a taper, right? Never get any runners that hate tapering. So why do we taper? Loads of reasons. So again, we know the optimal taper is about 2 weeks, and again that ties in with something we were talking about earlier, where we think we can peak performance last for around 2 to 3 weeks. And that's all we have. So again, we need to always think we can't be at our best all the time, because we've only got this 2 to 3 week window where we're at our peak, which is why training plans and using this kind of progressive overload in these waves, that's why it's so important to make sure that we time it right, so that on event day, we're at our absolute peak. So with 2 week tapering, we're reducing volume by around 50%, but maintaining frequency. So if you're running 3 times a week, carry on running 3 times a week, but reduce the volume dramatically. I would argue 50% is top end. I would look for anything, depending on your training age or your training history, how long you've been training, I would bring that down to 25% to 50%. More experienced runners would probably get away with 50%, but not everybody. And again, we're looking to induce that super compensation. So on our waves, again, where we're hitting our training at the right time, or hitting event day at the right time, right on the crest of that wave. And the benefits are massive. So 1 to 9% VO2 max increase if we do it right, if we time it right, 8% increase in running economy, 20% increase in neuromuscular function, so our strength, our power, etc. And then lovely, a reduced rate of perceived exertion, depression, anger, anxiety. I'm not sure about that anxiety. As race day gets closer, I've never known a runner say their anxiety's gone down, and reduced sleep disturbance. So to summarize, it always needs to be goal orientated to you. So it doesn't matter what someone else's training plan looks like. It doesn't matter what someone else's Strava account looks like. It always has to be goal orientated to you, whether you're on a 12-week plan, a 16-week plan, a 20-week plan, whether you're a first-time marathon runner, whether it's your 50th marathon runner. It has to be goal orientated to you. Otherwise, it's irrelevant. Always GPT, so general physical training before sport-specific training. We have to build that engine before we do our fine-tuning. Like I always say, know your dose response, know what you need to do, know how much you can get away with. So learn to listen to your body, know how much you can get away with before your body starts reacting negatively. And on our graph where we're looking at progressive overload, know exactly where your peak of your wave is. And it is a skill, and it takes a bit of getting used to, but you might be someone that can run every 24 hours, you might be someone that can run every 36 hours, it might take you 72 hours. And again, it's irrelevant to what your friends are doing and what your running club's doing. You need to learn to listen to your body and respect your body's boundaries. Always say recovery is key. That's the most fundamental part of marathon training. We're looking to build on cumulative fatigue, so we're looking to push you to fatigue, but you have to recover, otherwise your body will start breaking down, and we'll go through either, again, that principle of diminishing returns, where you're working harder than the gain you're getting, or your body's breaking down and you're overtraining. So we're trying to avoid that early rotten syndrome where, like I say, I always say to people, you don't want to leave your best runs in Swindon, whether you're doing London, Manchester, Brighton, Paris marathon, or Swindon half marathon, or common wheel 5 mile, it doesn't matter. You don't want to leave your best runs in your training runs with your friends. We should be looking to peak. Much like, again, like I'm very fortunate to work with people of Olympic standard. Like the events leading to Olympics are always important, but the Paralympics, that's our A game. That's what we're looking for. That's where we're looking to peak, and it's no different to any of us as recreational runners. So I hope it's been helpful, interesting if nothing else. If anyone has a training plan, whenever I'm working with runners, I always recommend they send me their training plan, not so that I can change anything necessarily, but at least I can offer input into where the best recovery weeks might fit, or where they might benefit from either treatment or a checkup, or even a phone consult at the moment. So yeah, thank you for listening once again. I shall stop sharing.